Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
Before we begin, and we hear from our guest speaker, it's our tradition to go around the room and introduce ourselves. With the Thanksgiving holiday just days away, if you feel moved to share something, a short word or a short phrase or word about what Thanksgiving means to you or how you're feeling at this time, please feel free. I'll begin. My name is Roy, warm in the kitchen.
My name is Barat, community.
I'm Leonard, coming together.
I'm Barry, opening to life.
I'm Freddie.
I'm Kay, family and friends.
I'm Manuel, love and happiness.
I'm Michael, those who feel like family.
My name is Ray Dyer. I'm grateful for friends.
I'm Daniel.
I'm Carl. Gratitude for the love in my life. I'm Joe.
I'm Bruce. Peeling grapes.
My name is David, and I'm grateful for Sangha.
My name is Danny. Love and friendship.
My name is Jerry, and I appreciate the friends in my life.
I'm Tom. Acceptance.
My name is Matt.
Joe, thankful for there's food available to eat.
My name is Rob.
My name is John, grateful for the arts.
My name is Mark.
I'm David.
I'm Shantanu.
My name is Gary, loving kindness.
Michael, friendship.
Stephen.
I'm Peter.
I'm Clint. Good food, good friends.
I'm Jack.
I'm Jerry.
Gary Dexter, family.
Peter, family and friends.
Michael.
Sylvie.
My name is Paige Lilia.
Doug, gratitude for friendship.
Jim Stewart, I'm grateful to my president.
My name is Jeffrey, family and friend.
My name is David, and I'm looking forward to the
I'm Richard. Looking forward to healthcare.
Anthony, looking forward to a 4-day weekend.
Alzak, traveling and relaxation.
I'm Tom Morrissey, and family and comfort.
On the equanimity in the face of fascinating food.
My name is Howard Deport, stunned by the harvest.
Baruch Golden.
Michael.
Patrick.
And Rob, grateful for my health today.
This is Robert Hopcke. He's a licensed marriage and family therapist in private practice in Berkeley. Along with his numerous articles and reviews published throughout the world, he's the author of the national bestseller, There Are No Accidents, Synchronicity and the Stories of Our Lives, which has been translated in over 24 languages. Currently adjunct faculty at the Institute for Transpersonal Psychology in Palo Alto, California, where he teaches in the areas of Jungian psychology and human sexuality. Rob is also an active practicing Roman Catholic and parishioner at Most Holy Redeemer, dedicated to finding and living out that elusive intersection of sexuality, spirituality, and psychological awareness. Welcome, Robert.
Always odd to hear your persona. It's like, hour ago I'm in the shower shaving, and like, oh my God, look at me, and I'm like, oh my God, I sound so what do I say, illustrious in that episode. Anyway, but I'm here. I'm so grateful to be here. They said there's going to be a 30-minute sit, and my friends are like, oh my God, what are you going to do? And I'm like, oh, that's the best part. I'm not looking forward to the speaking. I'm looking forward to the sitting with everyone. So it's just wonderful, because I was sitting over there, and when you're a psychotherapist, you spend a lot of time with people individually. And I could just feel all this great male energy come in the room while I was sitting over there quietly. It was just great. It was just great. So just want to say I love men. Get that out of the way. It was just, I could just feel it, So you're all very present. You can really just feel that. So, but I guess I wanted to speak a little bit about not being a Buddhist, a little bit intimidated by that, but I'm sure you all have wonderful Buddhist teachers that come through here. So I'm just going to speak a little bit about what Howard and I talked about, and that is my own practice of psychotherapy / spiritual direction with gay men over the years. Unlike, I think, some psychotherapists, I actually came into the profession through my religious practice, through my faith. I came out to California to go to seminary. I grew up in a very religious family, Lutheran family. And it's always been very important to me. Considered the ministry in my younger years and came out to California to go to seminary, but after the first year of seminary I realized that being a minister was more like being a church manager than it was really being a pastor. And I really wanted to work with people. So I shifted my program into pastoral counseling. So my whole first bit of training as a therapist was actually at seminary in pastoral counseling, and that's how I got my license. So a lot of times I think in professional psychology there's a kind of a divorce between religion and spirituality and psychology and science, and that was never really the case for me. They were always kind of married together for me right from the start. I went forward and did all the kind of professional things I needed to do, but that's really where I began. So for me, that's never really been that much of a divide, so to speak. And I think that's been really helpful in terms of working with, being a gay man and working with gay men as clients. And I'll talk a little bit about that, in a bit. So I went forward then to get sort of my clinical counseling training, which I did through Hayward State, and I actually got licensed on the basis of my degree in theology in California. When you can do that, you can't do that any longer. And, I think the next phase of my work really was my acquaintance with the teaching of Jung, Carl Jung, this psychologist, sometimes erroneously referred to as a student of Freud. So I always like to clear that stuff up. Freud and he had a kind of a brief relationship, about 7 years, and Jung was already well established as a professional, and a lot of Jung's ideas and Freud's ideas matched, and they had a correspondence, and kind of this strange, unconscious, homoerotic love affair with one another that sort of was both sort of father and son, and lover, and colleague, and competitor, and and if you ever want to read about it, the Freud-Jung letters are an incredible soap opera, So the two families, finally agreed to have these things published. And if you ever want to see these letters back and forth, their honeymoon period, and then they're actually working together, and then the stupendous breakup, in which Freud asks for his ring back, and I'm not kidding. I really, I'm not kidding. And then you add the whole Jewish Protestant thing into it, Freud sort of Jewish daddy, and Jung sort of brilliant Protestant, and Freud sexually repressed, and Jung fucking everything in Zurich, and it's just an amazing story. They crammed a lot into those 7 years. So, but after that ended in 1913, Jung went on to live to 1961. So I always like to kind of get that clear. My acquaintance actually came in my graduate school degree, and it was very helpful to me because I think coming out of a religious background, Jung provides a psychology of religion. In other words, a way of looking at spirituality and religion that doesn't really, well, quite the opposite, I was going to say, doesn't really insist on the exclusivity of any one religious path, but sort of looks at it from the other angle. In other words, understands that religion and spirituality is just, there's never been a culture, there's never been a person that doesn't have a spiritual or religious orientation. That it's part of the nature of being human to aspire to be in the presence of the transcendent. And that all throughout history and all throughout the world, different people do that in different ways. And Jung provides a kind of a single way of looking at it, which he calls the collective unconscious. So that's one concept I use a great deal. Just like all of us kind of have 2 eyes and, a hand with 5 fingers and 2 feet, Jung thought that all people share a certain set of psychological, psychological experiences with one another. Just like we all share sort of 2 hands, we all have an experience of birth, and we all have an experience of death. We have an experience of mother. We have an experience of father. Sometimes those experiences come through specific people, and sometimes those experiences come through other sources. We all have particular experiences of certain situations in our life that we all share as common human heritage, experiences of frustration, experiences of loss, experience of exaltation. And so I think a lot of times people don't understand, or they hear these words that, Jungian psychology, and I think they're very abstruse kinds of concepts, and that's not really true. I think what Jung is talking about when he says that there are certain elements of the human experience that are archetypal manifestations of a collective unconscious, that's what he means. In general, we don't walk around conscious too much of what we share with everyone else on the planet, which is why it's unconscious. But it's not deeply unconscious, and if you spend time and pay attention to it, you can bring forward for yourself, and in relationship, what you do share with other people. And so I feel like, specifically, when we're talking about the topic today, there are certain experiences of the sacred or the divine or the transcendent that are archetypal. And, Jung had a way of talking about that. So that's what I use in my practice. I've sort of used that a lot. What I find is, of course, that people who enter psychotherapy have encountered a certain level of brokenness, perhaps in their lives or in themselves. And they come for a certain kind of healing or wholeness. Another element of Jung's psychology that I really resonated with is his understanding that human beings are a little bit like the natural world as well. If you look at a plant, if it loses its branch, it starts to grow in a new way. It doesn't stop growing. It adapts to whatever has occurred to it. There's a certain kind of life force that's inherent in all living things that sort of moves towards growth and moves toward healing and moves towards completion. And just like that happens with, the plants or my beehives, when my beehives get kind of, assaulted by ants or something, they move around and they adapt. So too with the human psyche. And so I feel like there's a very positive way that Jung has framed what often looks like illness or brokenness or pathology. And so that's been very helpful for me. All of which then, I think, then leads to, I guess, what I would say sort of the final stage of my work with folks, which is that when we start really moving through the therapeutic process, I often say that the final stage of therapy is often spiritual direction. Because, once the person has kind of developed a certain sort of broad and reliable awareness of self through a lot of exploration of their own personal unconscious and their own awareness and openness to the collective unconscious that they experience through their dreams or through their relationships or through their practice, I feel like it's just very natural for people then to move to the transpersonal level of their experience, to move past who they happen to be in their own individual psyche and open up to what's around them that's beyond them in a certain way. Sometimes that's up front. I think sometimes people walk in with a spiritual practice or a religious faith that already framed that for them, and then we just sort of move there. But I guess that's a little bit what I wanted to sort of just present in some ways, that's sort of the outline of it for me. There's specific issues, I think, that I consistently see gay men struggling with, and that I have struggled with, of course, myself. Last week I taught human sexuality, a lovely thing to teach. Once I'm a master of human sexuality, maybe I can aspire to be a master of human sexuality. But, sort of the academic study of human sexuality is really what I'm teaching. And so it's sort of alive to me kind of how anti-sexual and anti-body in a certain way our culture is that we live in. Specifically, American culture is particularly kind of anti-sexual. There's a lot of what we call sex negativity. And of course, for us gay men, those are like times 10. There's a certain level of kind of really kind of pointed hatred and homophobia that's directed specifically at our sexuality. Maybe those of our sisters too. So I feel like that's kind of this sort of twin thing that we have to work with in some ways. And I guess alongside that, I guess what I try to live and try to then therefore sort of either teach or sort of invite folks into is what I guess I would call embodiment. I mean, there's a certain level of embodiment that I think is really the cure for that. Like that life force I talked about, sort of life force of soul, I feel like our sexuality, we come into being through sexuality. So I always think of sexuality as kind of a really very powerful and sacred life force that we all have to be able to tap into and contact and embody and contain and really live and use in a very respectful but also very sort of open and real way with one another. And that's really hard if you're living in a culture in which that's seen as something either shameful or frightening. And of course, very hard if you're gay or lesbian, in which, you have heard pretty much nothing but negative messages about that specific life force and how you express it. So I feel like that's one of the things that's in front of all of us, is sort of this reclamation of it in a certain way, the reclamation of the sacredness of it and the reclamation of the power of it. What's nice, I think, is that the psyche, the soul, cooperates in that as I see it in myself and in gay men, which is to say, like, if it's blocked here, it's going to come out in a different way. Or if you're sitting on it, it's going to come out in your unconscious. So a lot of times what will happen is what's often sort of referred to as maybe sexual compulsivity or psychopathology or nightmares are actually, I think, the manifestation of this wonderful and sacred and divine life force sort of breaking through because it's been blocked in other fashions. And so I think that's one of the ways in which I think about trying to help people toward healing, and particularly help gay men toward healing about it. But of course, in that embodiment is this kind of constant paradox, right? Because I feel like there is a certain, raw physical, sexual reality, sensual reality that's there. But I think it goes beyond just that. It's sort of like this experience of embodied spirit. And I feel like there isn't a lot of places in this culture, religiously speaking or spiritually speaking, in which you can actually reflect on that or hold that, or is really kind of a place where you can bring that level of reflection about your sexuality. Being Catholic, I can definitely attest to the fact that Catholic Church is not a place where you can do that very easily. There are certain places within the Catholic Church, broadly understood, communities, like Most Holy Redeemer, etc., and certainly communities of friends. I feel like, this obviously is a space where here we are, and this is a place where we can bring all of ourselves and sort of sit with it and really feel it and be conscious of it here. And so I feel like there are places that we've created for that, but I think so much more needs to happen with regard to all of that. And so I guess that's sort of what my own personal practice is and what I sort of dedicated my life to doing. So with regard to that, I guess the final thing I guess I want to say too in terms of people's spiritual paths, and this is a little bit sort of borrowed from James Fowler's work, and I think it's very helpful. And so those of you that aren't familiar with his work, I thought I might sort of bring that and sort of offer it to your own reflection, because you're all here on your own spiritual paths and thinking about it. And that is, I think, a lot of times what we'd say more in a Western tradition, religious faith, what I think Eastern or Buddhist practitioners might call more their spiritual practice, is sort of seen as a binary thing. Like you either have faith or you don't. You're either faithful to the practice or you're not, you know. And Fowler wanted to kind of break that open and sort of wanted to look at the way in which throughout the course of somebody's entire life, their spiritual practice or their religious faith kind of grows, changes, and matures, and that people go through stages of faith, really starting from childhood. So the first couple of stages he talks about are the way in which children understand religious or spiritual content in their life, often quite naively in the first stage, and then very sort of literally kind of in the second stage, like from ages 7 to 11, you know, sort of Sunday school. This story really happened, and that really, you know, and that's what this means, and this is how I have to behave. But what we see, I think, in adults, those of us that are doing psychotherapy or spiritual direction, are sort of the third, fourth, and fifth stages primarily. People develop into a certain kind of identification with the community in adolescence. You know, they bond with their peer group, and they get a certain identity from a collective. And that happens with regard to spirituality and religion as well. You know, that's where you sort of see, you know, I don't know, what's that new moon just came out? You know, sort of like Mormon vampires. That's like a great kind of, you know, kind of stage 3 conventional faith sort of representation. You know, sort of very kind of single-minded teenagers, very much identified with the group and how things are done. Ideally, what will happen is in early adulthood, then, and I think, you know, all of us are in adulthood at this point, so we know. There's a way in which, if you're true to yourself, you have to step away from that at some point. And you have to think about, what does all that mean for me personally and individually? And Fowler calls that the individuative, reflective stage of faith. I grew up Lutheran, or I grew up Catholic, or I'm engaged in Buddhist practice. And this is what the teacher tells me to do, or this is what the church has told me to do, but what do I need to do? How do I make that my own? I sort of think of 12-step programs, you know, take what you like and leave the rest, as a way of talking about that stage 4. And sometimes what happens, and this is unfortunately I think kind of frequent, is that people stay there. They stay somewhere between those two stages. When they get scared, they take refuge in all this collective stuff. And that happens, I think, very easily within the gay community. There's a very kind of, you know, discrete collective gay identity that a lot of people take refuge in, either spiritually or socially. And it's hard to sort of step away from the crowd. And yet, of course, that's our natural vector of growth, is to step away and make it individual. And so I see people kind of on the fence about that a lot. If you manage to kind of live in your own space for long enough, what will happen is it goes on to maybe the 5th stage, which is what he talks about, which is a certain, what he calls conjunctive, but I think I tend to call integrative. In other words, what you see is that there are certain archetypal truths in all of these paths. And there's a certain way in which deep, as we say, as the psalmist says, you know, in our psalms, it says deep calls on to deep in the roar of the waters. All of the waters are roaring, and yet the depths speak to one another under all of those different traditions. And you can only speak and connect with another person from your own deepest authenticity, but if you come from that place, their authenticity speaks to yours. And that's the 5th stage of it that Fowler talks about. The 6th stage, I think, is what we see here, which is the person who, you know, the very rare individual that in some ways has a transcendent faith and sort of moves past all of this into, you know, into the fullness of divine reality. In my tradition, that's Jesus. And in this tradition, it's Buddha. And then we see certain folks that incarnate that in their life as saints among us here, very sort of rare people. And we all have our stories about those. So I think that's a bit of what I bring to people's spiritual paths from where I come from. That's my own experience of it. And it's an interesting dance to kind of sort of, have a biography like that sort of read, in which I'm I'm a professional psychotherapist, but the actual content of the work, to tell you the truth, is in fact that strange, I said in the description, elusive connection between who we are as embodied spirit and how we participate in the life of the divine, and yet live within our very immanent, real limitations as human beings on this earth. One of the places you frequently grow, unfortunately, and this is, I think, again, speaking to a group of Buddhist practitioners, I think, something everyone can sort of resonate with, are experiences of loss and limitation in particular. And if I sort of say that, I think Barry is a long-time colleague of mine here. I think we both said, if it weren't for suffering, would any of us ever come to consciousness? In some ways, it sort of brings us to consciousness, sort of all of our desire and all of our wish to sort of be whole, and then that constant limitation of it, I think, really forces us to look deeper in a certain way. So I feel like that's one of the things that I, as a director, try to hold open a space for, and I think that's what perhaps each of us in our own lives, in our own practice, can hold open a space for within ourselves and for other people around us, a place where our limitations force us to look more deeply and sort of go beyond ourselves. Thank you for inviting me.
Any questions?
Yeah, your talk is really. I was just listening to the radio before I was coming here, and there was a discussion of St. Augustine.
Oh yeah, that's my confirmation name.
Oh,
I took his name for my confirmation name.
Yeah.
Late life convert, kind of a wild life beforehand. Wrote a lot of books. Augustine's my man. Martin Luther was an Augustinian monk.
Yeah.
Augustine Mary was actually my confirmation name. So. Okay. What did they say about Augustine?
So they were talking about, a psychologist came on and talked about Augustine and how where she disagreed in his kind of assessment of human sexuality was that he tended to fragment it and put it at something that needed to be. There was an essential sin in human sexuality. It was essentially sinful. So it put people at war with themselves in the spiritual realm because they were trying to extricate this essential piece of human nature. And so what I'm curious about is, I know in the 20th century, we started to break that pattern of that model, but I'm wondering, are there older traditions that did not follow that, even in the Christian tradition, that didn't follow that line, and really kind of move more toward the holistic relationship with human sexuality, or was that just kind of how it was through the Middle Ages?
Well, I guess what I would say is, if you go back, particularly to what I would say are essentially the Jewish roots of Christianity, you don't see that kind of dualism. That's sort of imported into Christianity through Greek metaphysics. But if you really go to the fundamental Jewish quality of Christianity, because Jesus was a Jew, you get to that wonderful place in Judaism in which, God's creation is good, let's enjoy it. So I feel like that's one of the places that I go, for example, to go past all of that got imported and kind of codified, which is to go to the more fundamental Jewish attitude toward the body and the fundamental Jewish attitude toward life. That's really inherent in Christianity, and that certainly was Jesus' own life as a Jew. And so I feel like the first few centuries of Christianity are very much rich with that kind of an attitude, and that's one place you can go as a Christian to take refuge from all of that anti-body stuff. And it's very, I think, authentic to our tradition in a certain way. And interestingly enough, too, and not to get too much into electron Christian history, but consistently throughout Christian history, that movement has been made by various people. My partner and I just translated The Little Flowers of St. Francis, for example, and the entire Franciscan movement. And St. Francis was an attempt to move back into a much more unified, natural experience of God in nature and in the body. And many of the stories, my next book is going to be The Jungian Lives of the Saints, in which I look at the stories of the Christian saints through Jungian lenses, or what kind of archetypal wisdom do these folk tales bring forward. And many of them in St. Francis are just right on that. You know, his fundamental kind of coming out spiritually is him stripping off all his clothes and walking down the middle of Assisi and preaching naked. I mean, it can't get any more body-affirming and life-affirming than that, you know. And so what happens is, you know, and that's the 1300s. I mean, consistently there are periods in which that essential wisdom and the goodness of God's creation, the goodness of our body, and the goodness of our sexuality is reaffirmed, and then quickly suppressed and co-opted by the hierarchy. So I feel like that's, you know, yeah, it didn't stop with Augustine, thank God, so it keeps going on. And I think that's sort of somewhat of a challenge, as you just said, sort of in the 21st century. How do we go there? I think what's lovely about gay, the kind of modern out-gay culture in some ways is that, particularly in my era, I think, you know, it was sort of like a political act to be sexual. You know, there was a way in which we really are dedicated to trying to find a positive and affirming sexuality as over against the culture at large. So I feel like we specifically in this culture carry a very important role in reminding people of how wonderful it is, right? And I think that's certainly why we're hated, and I think that's what threatens people, because that's a very, very countercultural movement. So.
Beautiful answer.
You're welcome.
Yeah, and here, can you talk a little about your understanding of synchronicity? I know you wrote a whole book about it, but it...
5 minutes or 5 hours?
Well, I read your book and I enjoyed it very much, but that has been translated into, what, 20 languages? 23
different languages.
It suggests that there's a lot of interest in...
Yeah. Well, I had a good agent, too.
We don't want to talk. But, I would like to hear how you understand the relationship between inner life and exterior phenomena.
Yeah. Well, for those of you that may not be too familiar with that concept, Jung actually coined the word synchronicity. So it really was not sting in the police. There are people that actually think Sting came up with that concept, so let's get that clear. Jung coined the concept. He wrote the book in 1950. What he wanted to do, I think, and a lot of people misunderstand the concept, and that's a little bit why I wrote the book, There Are No Accidents. It's very much consonant with his psychology. In other words, what he thought was that there are coincidences that occur in our lives that really don't have a whole lot of meaning. They're kind of fun and they're interesting, and, you know, I bumped into Barry today, and isn't that wonderful, and, you know, maybe meaningful, maybe not. But there's certain coincidences that bring certain things together for us that have been going on unconsciously. And those really are coincidences that have an amazing amount of emotional, psychological, sometimes spiritual power. And those specific kinds of coincidences is what he's calling synchronistic. In other words, meaningful coincidences. Now, because the meaning of those things sort of feels to our ego like it occurred to us. A lot of times people think about those coincidences as God, you know, as sort of out there, the meaning of them out there in the coincidence. But it's actually, Jung's point in coining the concept was that we bring a certain kind of basic meaning making to our life at all times, and we make those connections. So, you know, sometimes they're meaningless coincidences, but our unconscious is prompted by these coincidences to bring our own deeper self to bear in awareness in these incidents. And that's what I did in the book. In other words, I talked to people about the meaningful coincidences that had really changed their lives and what they made of them. So the subtitle of the book is this, There Are No Accidents, is this, what is the subtitle of the book? The stories of our synchronicity and the stories of our lives. In other words, we tend to think of our lives in a narrative way and make a story of it to knit that together. The culture at large often dismisses that. So what will happen, it's very funny, I would have these synchronicity interviews, and people who would be listening to some of the stories, it's like, oh, you're just making that up. You're just reading into all of these things. And I'm like, well, that's kind of the point. We all, like this stuff isn't laying out there under a rock. Like we bring our own awareness and we make meaning. And I wanted to give people permission to do that, to make a kind of a coherent narrative and a story of their life. So I think that's the basic concept of synchronicity. I look at those in people's work lives, people's love lives. I have a chapter on people's spiritual lives. And what happens is a lot of times people's spiritual paths are very much affected by synchronistic events. How I found my spiritual teacher, how I ended up going to this particular church. There's a way you could sort of say that prophetic dreams or certain kinds of miracles or healing are synchronistic in certain ways. I did X, Y, and Z practice, and suddenly they were made better. So I feel like I look through it through those lenses, which is to say that if we bring our psyche to bear on the events of our lives and we create meaning out of that, that's a good and desirable thing. That's not making up a story and reading more into it than we should. I kind of feel like Jung is a real champion of the subjective as opposed to the objective. So the objective scientific point of view is, well, you can't really prove that was what's happening. And Jung's point of view is completely the opposite, which is if you say it's meaningful, then I honor that in you and tell me more about it. And that's how synchronicity, it's very sort of popular topic, but that's how synchronicity fits very much into the program of psychotherapy or soul healing. You really want to create a space so that the individual can bring their own unconscious awarenesses to their consciousness and make a whole of their lives in that fashion. And synchronistic events are one place where that sort of just happens automatically and spontaneously. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it.
What if you reach a point where you're no longer surprised by synchronicity, but you're actually flowing as if that's a given? And you co-participate with synchronicity as a sensing together.
That's lovely. And I think one thing I guess I would say for someone like that is be aware of whatever you're doing that keeps you in that space. Mm-hmm. Because human awareness flows. Mm-hmm. What gets you off balance or what's distracting or, it's really kind of a dance. I mean, when you say flowing, that's kind of it. I think we all need to be aware of what do we need to do. That's why I feel like, perhaps Buddhism and my own tradition, Catholicism as well. There's certain practices that I engage in that I know will kind of keep me in that sweet spot. And when I don't do them, I get off kilter. So that's I think pretty much the goal. In fact, many of the people that I interviewed for the book. We're kind of like that. I mean, I interviewed them specifically because every day of their life, they're like have a synchronistic event occur in that sense because they're very much aware of it. It's no longer sort of an unusual event. What I found most delightful, however, was of course the opposite condition. These like hard-bitten businessmen, these shut-down people whose lives are completely broken open in ways that they didn't want, didn't expect, resisted, and yet had to essentially, submit to. And they were the most interesting ones, of course, Those of us that are kind of on that wavelength anyway, I mean, that's expectable. But, these folks that are like, those folks were just really very interesting to speak to. So there's a kind of a wide variety of experiences in that book. Actually, some of Barry's.
and I just had another one just now. About a week or two ago, I was thinking about a man that I met at the University of Chicago about, since I guess it was 85 or 86 at a gay students gathering. I was thinking about him a week or two ago, from 25 years ago, and he's right over here.
There it is.
That's your day for remembering to people.
Yeah.
Barry's kind of like a synchronicity vortex.
Yeah.
So just stick close, and who knows what will happen.
You covered this to some degree in your previous question, but I wonder if you could go a little bit more about sexuality and Christianity, because it seems like so much emphasis is put upon Mary being a virgin, Jesus being totally celibate his entire life, and this carries on to like the priests and nuns now have to be celibate.
It's true. Well, that's the problem. Sure.
And it's just I've been raised in a Christian background, and I left it, well, for one thing, because I couldn't stand the homophobia.
Yeah.
And right now, the people that seem to be most adamant about one particular form of sexuality, only correct way, are Christians.
That's true.
And I wonder how you with your own Christian faith, how you're able to reconcile that.
It's actually really not that hard for me, and I guess because I think, to one of the fundamental truths of my specific tradition, the Christian tradition, and that is that we believe, and in some ways I would say I know, from my perspective as a Catholic, that the divine was made human. So I feel like all of the rest of this bullshit that we're hearing essentially kind of gets away from the essential incarnational quality of the Christian faith. When you walk into a Catholic church, you see bodies. A fundamental piece of the Christian faith, which is really what distinguishes it from perhaps all other world religions, is the idea that God actually became a man, entered into human life, and lived a full and complete human life, including his sexuality. And so I feel like that's where I go and attempt in a certain way to remind my own church of that fundamental truth about God's action in the world, which is easily forgotten. And I feel like that's my experience of almost everything that I live in my faith. You know, I mean, my experience of Christ is very much of a human being. My experience of the Eucharist is actually participating in his body. That piece of his body is what my experience of the Christian community is, in bodies, with other people. You know, there's a way in which, in the course of our Eucharistic liturgy, we say that we take a small piece of the bread and we put it in the wine, and it says just as the divine became human, so too do we aspire for our humanity to become divinized. The whole idea is for each one of us to be Christ in the world and to live that out in our own incarnation. So I feel like that's what I would say. I mean, the way that I say it is that it's an incarnational religion. You know, we're coming up on Christmas, and the reason Christmas is important is the idea that somehow God became human, was actually born as a baby, you know, came through Mary and her experience. So I feel like there's a lot of anti-sexuality, obviously, in the tradition, but I feel like that's really at odds with its own fundamental incarnational quality. I mean, there's a certain, I think, one of the things that I sometimes say is that there are different, and this is actually official church teaching too, as far as the Catholic Church goes, that there are different orders of meaning in theology. And certain things are more fundamental and indisputable, and other things are more temporary, and kind of, what do I say, sort of logistical or strategic. So I feel like when we go to the creed, you know, our essential statement of faith, that's what it's about. It's about the divine entering into the human experience, so that the human experience can be divinized and created. So that's my answer. I mean, people tend to want to argue with me about all of that, but that's where I go. That's why it's meaningful to me. I have an ongoing experience of the way in which my faith actually informs my physical and sexual experience. You know, when you're eating and drinking as a sacred part of your practice, it's really hard to get away from the physicality of it. I think there's a way in which
Where's the eroticism? I mean, I just don't see a celebration and joy of eroticism. I mean, what you said was very interesting, but it came to me as very intellectual. I don't see just real bodily eroticism in the Christian church.
Well, you haven't actually taken Jesus into your body through the Eucharist in the way that I have. That's all I can say to you. I mean, every day at Mass, I receive him in my body. It's not erotic in the sense that my penis is involved. It's erotic in the sense that my whole body is involved in the mystery of creation. It's mystical on some level, but that doesn't mean it's disembodied. And there's a certain power to that. That's our central experience of God in my church. All the rest of this stuff is very easy to forget. When you have a level of intimacy with God that's so concrete and ordinary and everyday and yet transcendent and loving and full. So I feel like that's where it's at for me. And they can pass whatever laws they want to pass, and he can say whatever he wants to say in Rome, and they can call me whatever name they want to call me, and that doesn't change the moment of my Eucharistic presence with Jesus. So
I would just like to make a point to reinforce some of the points you're making here. Is there was actually a program on KQED last night. I wasn't sitting down to watch it, but listening at a distance. And the point of the program was that it was the whole scholarly investigation that Jesus actually had a number of brothers and sisters in his whole family. And the point there being that
thanks to Dan
over
Brown,
time, that the Gospels wrote out in terms of this conflict between human and divinity and divine, and the insistence that the Virgin Mary's virgin. I mean, I come from the Catholic tradition myself, but not too much to the church these days. But I thought it was very interesting. There's been so many distortions over the ages of things that have been written into dogma that aren't connected to the real message that's
tradition. Well, I think that's true about any kind of long religious tradition. And then, you get your distortions. And it's happening in Buddhism as well, to tell you the truth,
And it comes back to your point of having to trust your own experiences.
Sort of my arguments with my SGI lesbian sisters about Buddhism and what Buddhism really is. I'm like, okay. I guess it's always very funny. It's sort of like when you're outside the tradition, like, oh, great. I'm glad they're all arguing over there on that side of the fence, too, the way we are over here on my Christian side of the fence. This Nam Myoho Renge Kyo Buddhism. And, I forget, there was one Thanksgiving in which they were pronouncing Zen a heretical sect, and I was like, oh, that's the new take on things. I was like, okay. I'm like, okay. Anyways, any long religious tradition's got its distortions and its truths.
So thank you for your answer to Clint. I felt the power of your experience in the mundane and the transcendent in that act of communion. I think that was really interesting. I was curious to get your thoughts on what you see are the archetypal elements that are being expressed through gay men, for example, and how do you use that in your psychotherapeutic practice with clients? How does that kind of facilitate healing or greater understanding or?
Yeah, a lot of my writing, not so much recently, but earlier on, was on that specifically, because Jungians really hadn't touched any of the archetypal themes that were involved in homosexuality. Well, I think one of the things, I think for lesbians, maybe femininity, for us gay men, masculinity in a particular way, comes through most clearly. I mean, there's a way in which we sort of live out an archetypal masculinity in a particular way by mirroring one another as men, and so it's sort of really brought to the fore, well, sort of the phallic quality of the power of masculinity, the beauty of masculinity, its effectiveness, its seminal quality in a certain sense. There's a lot of mirroring that occurs within homosexual couples that I think is so healing and wonderful, and I feel like that's one archetypal piece that's, archetypal piece in the sense that that's constantly mirrored in the mythology of homosexuality, sort of brothers and twins sort of finding one another and supporting one another and kind of bringing the self to the self and in return bringing the self to the self. And sort of there's a way in which that's often, I think, kind of, when I say sort of disrespected, as kind of masturbatory or solipsistic or narcissistic. But I think from the inside of my experience as a gay man, sort of meeting myself in another man is one of the major archetypal themes, I think, within the mythology of homosexuality. Sort of really being, it's a way of coming to oneself most fully. So in that sense, it's sort of an alternative path, so to speak. It's another way of meeting the self. So rather than meeting the self through difference, through heterosexual difference, we meet the self through seeing one another in each other as men. But then there's also the opposite of that, right? Which is that they're consistently within the mythology of homosexuality, there's a real element of androgyny that I think we bring, and I think we see that in our community in particular, which is really wonderful too. There's a way in which sort of these male and female gender constructions bequeathed to us through every culture get broken down within the experience of same-sex love. And that's also kind of mirrored in the mythology, that gay men, whether they're the Native American Berdache that are sort of the spiritual teachers, or whether they're the sort of the Indian transgender folks that sort of walk around begging, or whether they're our own experience of the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence in some ways. There's a way in which androgyny is a certain archetypal quality, this kind of mixing of genders, and what that means is, and then consequently kind of the next piece of that is that because we transcend gender, we also transcend, period. But we become spiritual teachers or mediators, So sort of by going beyond the limitations or categories of human life, homosexual people are often kind of the sacred people or the spiritual teachers or the mediators between the human and the divine in various cultures as well. So there's really kind of a sacredness to homosexuality because of that kind of, because of that androgyny in a certain way. So I feel like those are like at least two of the kind of archetypal themes that you really see. One of the ways that Jungians go about this is you look at myths and stories and legends and cultural tales, etc., and see kind of what's there, like what's being exposed about the nature of this. And so how do I use that in the healing? I use that in the healing because I think so many of us bring in, particularly psychotherapists, so many gay men, lesbians, gay men, homosexual people bring in so much shame or embarrassment or judgment about it, and my approach is informed by knowing that, in fact, this is one way people have always been. So this isn't a pathology. And that there is a way in which, if you live it out authentically, it can move you toward transcendence if you really honor it in yourself and honor it in another person. So I feel like it's the way in which I've been able to go past the homophobia that we all have to kind of disingest, sort of throw up and get out of ourselves, and that's where that's where Jung's ideas and archetypal psychology have been really helpful. When you realize that there hasn't been a culture in which there have not been homosexual people, and that those people have been honored in other cultures for their particular perspective, their particular kind of non-normative perspective on things. Well, that makes it really very easy to kind of be gay, and to be gay pretty fully, and to help other people really honor that in themselves, whatever form that might take, because I feel like also, too, we have a couple of boxes that we think in, and people really aren't like that either. They're not just gay, and they're not just straight, but, there's a way in which there's a kind of fluidity of sexual orientation that people evince in the course of their life that I've experienced as a therapist. So I feel like that sort of just breaks it open in a particular way. It's a different way of thinking about it. And as I said, it feels to me like it honors it in a certain way. It values it in a certain way.
Excuse me, Robert.
Sure.
We're short on time.
Oh, cool. All right.
Will you be able to stay for the social hour?
Yeah, sure.
If you have any questions, will you be okay to answer?
Wouldn't miss it.
Thank you very much for coming and sharing.
Thanks all.
Thank you. Can we hear from our host?
Yeah, my name is Keith. I'm the host today. There's some baked goods and fresh fruit outside. And there's also hot water available for tea. Please wash your mug after you're done and put it in the dish rack. I've been be going around with the Donna Bowl as well. Suggested donations are $5 to $8. Please give generously. There's a newcomer sign-up sheet outside. If you wish to receive our newsletter, please write down your street address and email address. And finally, some members go out to lunch after the meeting and social hour. The group usually meets near the front door around 12:30.
Announcements?
Yes, on this Thanksgiving Day, there will be our annual traditional Thanksgiving potluck, and it will be held at my place in the East Bay at 4 p.m., but that's when that people can start arriving. People can arrive as late as you want, though we typically start eating at around 5:30, 6 o'clock. So if you're interested in attending, please let me know so that I'll make sure that there'll be enough food, and also I can coordinate a little bit about the food people will be bringing. And this event really is a nice warm gathering of not only our Sangha members but their friends and families as well. So feel free to bring your friends, family members, or your mom.
Robert, just really want to thank you for being here this day. We've just been blessed and honored by your teaching. And it feels good to welcome a member of the Roman Catholic tradition in the community.
Blow for interreligious dialogue right here in your presence.
Our gathering next week will be a small group discussion, so we'll be open discussions in the Sangha. It's really one of the areas in our program where we try to create opportunity for the Sangha to deepen their relationship with each other, and we break up into small groups, share, reflect, and discuss about topics generally that the facilitator offers, whatever's really working you in your life around the Dharma or other details. So that is next Sunday. And then December the 6th, the first Sunday of December, we will be graced by Jack Moran, who's returning again. Jack, a national best-selling author of Anal Pleasure
and Health.
And Health. And
sex positive message from way back.
Absolutely. Actually, his book now is in its 4th edition, reprinting, and so I've been talking with Jack about topics, and I really encourage him to make sure he creates a lab experience for us.
Don't ask him, he'll do it.
So he still hasn't decided.
New meaning to the word sit.
So that's Sunday, December 6th.
Thank you. He's a delight.
Yeah, also that same weekend, the Saturday night and then Sunday evening, the 5th and the 6th, the San Francisco Choral Society is performing Bach's Magnificat and the last 3 cantatas of the Christmas oratorio. It's really glorious music, and we are singing it really well. And we're really conducted. And Bill Childs is also in the group, and it's there's so much terrible holiday dreck out there, and this will cleanse that palate.
Anyone else?
I'd just like to say that I'm facilitating next week that group discussion, so if somebody has a topic they would like for me to suggest to the group, please let me know.
Anyone else? Okay, we can stand. Dedication to marriage.
Okay, so I just read it out loud. Give me one service. By the power and truth of this practice, may all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all be free from sorrow and the causes of sorrow. May all never be separated from the sacred happiness which is without sorrow. And may all live in equanimity, without too much attachment or too much aversion, and live believing in the equality of all that lives.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.